and welcome to Season 5, Episode 7 of ARBinBRIEF, a practical video guide on handpicked arbitration issues. My name is Deniz Özyıldız. I will be moderating today's episode on document production and adverse inference featuring Kamalia Mehtiyeva and Shreya Aren. Document production is often seen as a procedural step, but sometimes it can shape the outcome of the case. And with our experienced panel, we will explore not just when document production is granted, but how it is used strategically and what happens when parties fail to comply. Let's start with a practical question. My first question will go to Kamalia. In your experience, when do tribunals actually grant or reject document production requests? And how do tribunals typically deal with fishing expeditions or overly broad requests?
Thank you, Deniz. Hello, everyone. Indeed, it's a very important practical question. For a document production request to be granted, certain conditions must be met, and tribunals check whether these conditions are met or not when dealing with the requests and the challenges to document production requests. So first and foremost, the request must be specific. It must be narrow and specific, and the documents must be reasonably believed to exist and to exist in the possession or control of the party to which the request is addressed. So it's extremely important to know what you're asking, to justify why you're asking that, to explain the link between the claim and the document that is being requested. And for that, there is a common criteria, universally, let's say, accepted criteria, international arbitration, and those criteria are the relevance and materiality of your request. So the tribunals check whether the document that is requested is relevant, that is the benchmark, if they are material to the case, and if that is not justified, obviously the document production request is rejected. Now, it's very easy sort of theoretically to explain, but when it comes to applying, there may be doubts whether the document is relevant, is it material. There are less doubts whether it is in the possession or the control of the party. But as to I would say the core debate between the parties on the document production relates to whether it's relevant material or not. And so the practice has allowed to forge such concept as a fishing expedition, which obviously relates to excessively broad, egregious document production. Again, that may not happen. That does not happen all the time, because fishing expedition is really something very, very broad, overbroad sort of request. But today it is used as a term to designate any and all documents. Sometimes parties refer in their request to any and all documents without really specifying what exactly. So that definitely does not meet the test, the benchmark of narrow and specific. So grants are never, requests are never granted when they're not specific, when they're disproportionate, when they're burdensome, and as we all know, reference schedule process serves as a principal battleground for resolving these disputes around document production requests at the margins of the reference schedule.
Thank you. That was a very fair summary of the whole process. And Shreya, what's the common law approach to document production?
Well, Denise, I'd like to start off by thanking you and the ARBinBRIEF team to invite me to talk about document production, which I really think is an evergreen topic in international arbitration. But turning to your question about common law, I think under common law, which is considered a more adversarial approach to dispute resolution, document disclosure or discovery, as it tends to be called, is seen as essential to a level playing field between the parties and for transparency and towards the aim of finding what is called the objective truth. And it's often described as having both parties having their cards up on the table approach. It's also usually conducted between the parties in the first instance, and the judges only become involved subsequently if it becomes necessary. The general threshold under common law for document discovery or disclosure tends to be lower than what is under international arbitration, which is what Kamalia was just explaining. And for example, under English law, there tend to be two phases, which is standard disclosure and then additional disclosure. And standard disclosure requires parties to disclose documents that are in support of their own case, but also adverse documents that the party is aware of, which either affect its own case or support the other party's case. And then you have additional disclosure that can happen subsequently with the judge's involvement. But having said that, most common law jurisdictions have also, in the last couple of decades, started introducing proportionality requirements similar as like an overriding objective, similar to what we see in arbitration.
Thank you. And Kamalia, do you see any meaningful differences between civil law and common law approaches in this context?
I think the answer to this question is threefold. It's a yes, then it's a no, and then perhaps again yes. So yes, definitely there is a very important structural difference. I would say philosophical differences because the foundational procedural philosophy between the two systems are extremely different. So where in common law, as Shreya just mentioned, the document production is in fact it's an essential fact-finding tool. You may discover facts, not only establish them or complete sort of the fill in the gaps, the lacunes in your evidentiary basis in your record. You can actually find out new facts. In civil law, when we talk about civil procedure, requests are traditionally limited to documents that prove, that establish facts that are already established by either other documents or, let's say, copies, but we need an original or an unsigned document. So we need something to complete that fact, which is already known and perhaps established or almost established. So civil law courts have historically, very seldom ordered parties to produce materials, to produce documents, which have not been voluntarily offered because they consider that broad discovery is intrusive and it's not a civil procedure tool. However, with international arbitration, the IBA rules, for example, they were conscious of differences between the two systems of law, between the two philosophies, and in fact, Article 3 of the IBA rules has is expressly designed to be a compromise between the two traditions. So as we see, yes, there is a difference because I would say the one of the essential international documents, which is the IBA rules on evidence, expressly relates, acknowledges that difference and deals with that difference. Now, it is also recognized that document production is the key area of difference between the two, and a compromise needs to be found, although practitioners consider that IBA rules tend to lean towards common law more than civil law. And that's where I think the answer is also no. It's that the difference is not that meaningful anymore because the common law has prevailed already. Some consider that it's not common law that prevails, but it's the international arbitration has its own style. But whatever the view is, definitely the document production requests has entered the arbitration family, arbitration tradition, as a part of arbitration law. And now maybe again why yes it's still relevant. If you look at the cultures of arbitrators when they adjudicate document production requests, they do not motivate, they don't look at the request in the same way because you have the reference schedule, but then you have a case-by-case basis you need to adjudicate. So for example, what we tend to see is that common lawyers would use they interpret or rely on the term relevance. So relevance of a document is the typical common law disclosure concept, which is more broad, I would say, broadly understood, whereas the civil lawyers, civil law practitioners would take into account not relevance but materiality to outcome, which does show that there is civil law influence. So yes, it is fundamentally important to have that in mind. However, international arbitration, it should not be overstated, but with the practical sort of differences, approaches that we still find in adjudication of document production requests.
Thank you. And Shreya, to what extent is document production used by parties as a strategic tool rather than as a purely evidentiary tool in your experience?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think document production is definitely used strategically by parties. And you have like quite benign examples, right, of making your own points in submission or pointing out where the other party is lacking on evidence on their side. But then you also have perhaps more egregious examples of asking for broader categories of documents because you know they will be narrowed, or asking for many more categories of documents on the basis that the tribunal may only grant some of them. And I think counsel often complain about getting 500-page long document production. I'm sure arbitrators do that as well. And then also, I think what is, again, another strategic use of document production is satellite disputes and issues that can arise out of document production. And privilege is a paradigm example of that because it's a very knotty issue in international arbitration, and it can take several weeks sometimes to address those kind of satellite disputes related to document production. So what all of this does, it leads to delays, leads to cost inflation, and especially because document production often happens after the first round of submission, and parties will then say we can't do the second round of submission until the document production phase is complete. And obviously, there are some cases in which the dispute is absolutely legitimate, and I don't want to overgeneralize, but on the whole, the general perception tends to be that document production is quite costly and burdensome, and the output doesn't necessarily match the input in most cases. But one of the main issues, in my view, is that arbitrators kind of lack the coercive powers that common law courts have in policing document production or discovery in their case. And so even though we've imported the procedure from common law, we've perhaps not imported the complementary powers to police the procedure in the same way. And I know, so we're coming to this next, which is what are the sanctions that international arbitrators can actually impose in the context of document production, because they tend to be very different from what common law courts can do in that respect.
Thank you. It's very important to touch on that as well, which brings us to the key question of consequences. How often tribunals actually draw adverse inference? And my next question is to Kamalia. What typically motivates a tribunal to draw an adverse inference?
Yeah, it's very, indeed, very important and not an easy question. Well, adverse inference, as we know, is a possibility which is universally recognized for international arbitrators to draw a specific probative consequences of the breach of the order to disclose. So there must already be an order to disclose a specific document which is supposed to be or established to be in the possession or in control, as we mentioned earlier today, of the party which is targeted, which is to which the request is being sent. So the tribunal may impose different sanctions, but this one is during the arbitral process, but this one is very specific, which is not drawing a sanction of the fact that the party does not, produce a document, but drawing adverse inference, and the extent of that consequence is not known to the parties until they actually see the award. And I think that is a very important element. The reason why arbitrators jumping straight to the bottom line of the question is that, in fact, IBA rules and international practice expressly provide arbitrators with the power to draw adverse inferences in appropriate cases. And specific factors, according to international practice, do trigger that possibility. For example, there is an order, there is a non-compliance with the order to produce. The existence of the document must be established. And of course, the burden of proof that the documents are in the possession of that party lies with the party that requests the document production. Sometimes there are circumstances, of course, which make it impossible to demonstrate that the document is in the hands of the other party. But once all of that is clear, then of course it becomes possible to draw adverse inference. Now, unless there is evidence that the relevant evidence has been destroyed, for example, in which case in practice we do see frequent examples of adverse inference. What we can say is that tribunals are rather hesitant to draw, in a blunt way, in an open way. First, because it's very difficult to fit that into the award. So presuming that something happened or did not happen, or presuming that the party has lied or is lying or is not loyal, is very difficult on the basis of just one document or a series of documents that are not produced. And also because this means drawing adverse inference inference means that the other party has perfectly established the relevance, the materiality, the absence the lack of the document itself or herself, himself, the fact that established also that the document is in the possession of the other party. All of that is quite a lot of things to demonstrate. But even with that, the arbitral tribunal would look into that more as a global picture. If the party, in other ways also is not loyal, in its attitude, does not respect the principle of integrity of arbitration proceedings. So just the lack to comply with the production order often is not enough to draw adverse inference.
Thank you, Kamalia. And Shreya, Kamalia mentioned that tribunals can be reluctant to apply the adverse inference. It's difficult to choose that path. Do you believe it's an effective tool, or do tribunals have sufficient tools at their disposal, perhaps other sanctions for non-compliance?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. And I think there are three issues with how adverse inferences are used in international arbitration. I think first, as Kamalia mentioned, they're not used enough. Second, I think even when they are used quite narrowly. And I think third and most importantly, I think non-production of documents, it usually tends to be only one of the factors that's considered in drawing adverse inferences, and it's the overall conduct and everything else together that's considered. And actually, there's a really interesting line that I came across in one of the articles I was reading where it said that adverse inferences are bats of the law, flitting in the twilight but disappearing in the sunshine of actual facts. And so it depends on whether the evidence is enough for an adverse inference to be drawn. And it's difficult for tribunals when they're being told, look, the documents just don't exist. It's difficult for them to assume that the parties are not acting in good faith, right? So I think then it begs the question of whether an adverse inference is an adequate remedy. And some commentators have argued that they are a remedy that does not have teeth, and therefore maybe strike out of claims and defenses might be an appropriate remedy. But to my mind, this is primarily a compliance issue, and I wonder whether there should be more of a procedural solution to that. And there will still be arguments that such remedies lack teeth, but I think tribunals might be more willing to order cost sanctions, for example, rather than sanctions based in merits. And Article 9.8 of the IBA rules, for example, does allow tribunals to take non-compliance with document production orders into account while ordering costs of the arbitration. But I think for this to be effective, it has to be in the form of an interim costs order, because if it's at the end of the proceedings, I think that's too far down the line. ICSID now has a specific provision for interim costs order, for example, and anecdotally at least, tribunals are starting to use it more and more. So on the whole, I don't think I can go far enough to say that they're not effective or they don't serve any purpose, because I think they do deter parties from non-compliance to some extent. But I do think that they need to be supplemented with cost sanctions in situations where perhaps you don't have sufficient evidence to give the adverse inference, but you still want to do something about the non-production of documents.
Thank you. It was very insightful. Now, normally I have one more question, but I'm saving it for the Q&A session for those of you who want to hear the next topic, whether it's still worth it. Please join our Q&A session. But before we end this webinar, thank you to our panelists for this very insightful discussion on the topic that continues to evolve in practice. And we would like to also thank our partner organization, ARBIPledge and AAA ICDR Asia Case Management Center for their support in making Season 5 possible. We are also truly grateful to the many organizations that support the marketing of our series around the world. And for those of you who are watching us over YouTube, our video ends here. Thank you for joining. To see future ARBinBRIEF videos, please follow us on LinkedIn and like and subscribe to our channel on YouTube.